Hey, Lonny, it's nice to meet you. I have Lonny Ray Williams here with me. He's running for Washington State Legislative District 7, Position 1. And hey, Lonny, just tell people a little bit about you and what inspired you to run and a little bit about your background.
Hello, thanks for having me. Yes, well, what inspired me to run obviously was the shape of the country that it's in right now. My wife and I have been doing a publication for the past couple of years called The Pamphlet. It's a publication about liberty and freedom, our founding values. We talk about our history. For example, we try and tell little-known stories like a 16-year-old girl called Sybil Luddington. She rode twice as far as Paul Revere, and yet we don't necessarily hear about that. And so we like to try and use original sources and tell bits of history that you might not know, because there was so many more people who participated in that process. And our goal is to energize people, to get children to learn their history, to understand our founding values and how it applies today. And in doing that, we had a lot of people come forth and say, hey, you write about this, you talk about this, this is the type of leadership we want, and would you consider running? And it got louder and louder, and as I looked at it, I looked at the various candidates in the area and I feel that this is the area where I could make the greatest impact, and so that's why we decided to go this route.
Right, and so for your district, explain a little bit about where your district is, the landscape of your district.
This district is actually geographically, I believe it's the 11th largest in the United States. It encompasses seven counties in whole or in part. And it's roughly about 139,000 individuals there, but it's scattered out under a large geographic area. So there's also mountain ranges that divide it. There's tribal considerations. There's environmental considerations. There's a whole gamut. I think it's 18 of the 24 border crossings into Canada on Washington State are within this district. So there's also border issues that are complex. And for a state legislator, that means they need to be in touch with what the needs of the people are, specifically living right on the border and talking with them, seeing what their issues are, and how the state can actually implement and support our federal partners to ensure that the border is secure. So it's a huge geographic area.
Spans. It's a pretty big district then.
That's
and
correct.
so we talked a little bit before coming on about Roe v. Wade and
Yes.
how important Roe v. Wade now has become for the state legislature. So I'm just going to jump into it. We're on Lonny's survey, page 4, under life, our statement is that God created man in his image. The duty of civil government is the protection of innocent human life from conception until natural death. The issue application is that Washington State's reproductive privacy rights laws allow minors to obtain abortions without parental consent. Additionally, this law requires taxpayer-funded abortions on demand. Late-term abortions are legal throughout all 9 months of pregnancy in Washington because of the vague way that viability is defined in this law. And our response is that the reproductive privacy rights law needs to be challenged and or repealed at both the state and local levels. You responded to 10, strongly agree, and you commented that life begins at conception, full stop. Anything less is murder, in my opinion, and I will seek to protect the lives of all of those who cannot protect themselves. So what would you say to someone who says, well, what about in the instances of rape and incest and so on? How would you handle that situation in the legislature when this comes up? Because it inevitably is now, because now we, the people, have the power to legislate this.
And, those questions on the surface seem very difficult. And I was really questioning how do we go about this. But on a fundamental level, one, I have to agree with NASA scientists on life. And that means that if we discover a single cell on Mars, that's life. So on a scientific level, single cell organism equals life. Now, with that in mind, we understand that there's emotional attachments and everything else, but the life has a right to live. And I was trying to figure out, well, how do we approach this subject? And then I ran across a few videos of a lady in the South running as a state legislator, and her mom was 14 years old when she was raped, and her mom ended up having her. So from her perspective, this young legislator's perspective, she ran on a "don't abort me." Look at the life that I've lived or led. Mm-hmm. Look at what I've accomplished. Sure, absolutely, tragedy happens every day. And if you read anything about life during our founding father period, tragedy was part of life. There were terrible things that always happened. And that's where faith is important, so that we can turn to God and say, why, God? How does this happen? His plan is always so much more perfect than ours. And we don't always understand that. And blessings can take years or decades to mature. Something terrible can turn out, especially in my case, I understand this. I had a stroke in 2008 and lost everything. But it turned out it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was a terrible thing to go through, and it took me years to rehabilitate. And, it was a struggle. However, it caused me to come back to God. It caused me to reevaluate my life. And from then, everything has just made sense. Whereas anyway, I don't need to go too much into that, but so I can understand that tragedy, although terrible at the time, if you have the support, whether faith-based or other, if you can give someone the emotional support to carry on, to make it through it, then it turns out that tragedy actually builds resiliency and strengthens people. And that's what we need to focus on, is turning tragedy into strengthening people. And yes, there are terrible things that happen, rape, incest, all of those things. But yet God has a plan. And it's a perfect plan that we as human beings can't understand. But through love and compassion, we can help other people through this and be there for them. There are plenty of families who would love to take that child who can't reproduce on their own and raise them and give them fantastic opportunities.
Right. And I think part of this struggle, and I've mentioned this with just about every candidate that I've interviewed, that my struggle with this, and I think about this a lot. I actually think about like almost every couple of days, I'll be mowing the lawn or doing something, and I really do think through this, like, hey, God, like, what about in those instances? I know there's no gray area when it comes to morality. It's very clear. We're told very clearly in the Ten Commandments what you shall not do, so the struggle for me has been, well, what about those women who go through the trauma of rape, the trauma of incest, and then 2 months later they then now have the trauma of finding out they're pregnant. I mean, that not even just men, but women who haven't gone through this, it's inconceivable, right? It's so hard to understand. And I just had a great conversation yesterday with P. Brian Noble, and he had said, that's when as that victim, you can be most Christ-like, that you can humble yourself and give up yourself for that child. And so it was just a refreshing perspective that I hadn't, I've heard different things and so on, but it was just really, really challenged me to think again and think through that, which I'm still processing. But it is a difficult issue. And so, and the key here is that we understand that these things are hard. And as a community and as Christians especially, we should be lifting up those people and serving them and saying, this
Absolutely.
is life. You don't go through with an abortion. We can help you. We can arrange adoption. We can, all these things, and we should be propping them up. And I think that at large, not always, I know of organizations and even churches that really get involved in this way. We do fail people. We fail our fellow brothers
Absolutely.
and sisters in Christ, and we also fail non-believers. And those are the people, to me, that we could bring to Christ by showing them Christ. So this is a very difficult issue, and but it is very, very, very important now, because once you get into that seat, if you are elected, this is going to be a battle now. This is the new battle of the state.
It's already a battle. I mean, right now, candidates are positioning, how can I walk this line to bring this over? And that's not how we should be thinking as candidates. It's this is what I believe, and this is my moral actions. Now, on the other end, we're also representatives, and we live in a representative government. So we have to take into consideration that we're supposed to represent the people. So we need to bring these issues to the people and say, what say you? And get their input. Because if we truly want to be a representative government like our founding fathers, then those people that we send there must take into consideration heavily what the people say, because they are a direct representative. And by people, I mean individual people, common people, everyday people, not corporations, not big companies. And those are the people who have influence because they're treated as people. But we need to bring back this representation to the community level so we can understand this, like, okay, we have this problem. And generally we're a people of faith here, at least in this community. How would we want to do it? How can we support people like that? Ideally, all the problems way back then were solved on a community and local level. And that's what we need to bring back, because when we make our communities thrive, then a lot of these challenges get taken care of.
Right.
My mother, for example, was adopted because my grandparents could not have children. And, she was the result of one of those cases there. So if abortion would have been available back then, and that mother chose to take that, I wouldn't be here. So the implications on what I've achieved, my children will achieve, my time in the military service, my daughter's time in the military service, all those contributions to humanity, we remove those possibilities. And in short, we're playing God on who has the opportunity to live their life to the fullest.
So you said something really important there, and I want to touch on it a little bit. So in the Roe v. Wade ruling, I believe it's page 14, when Justice gave the succinct closing statement, he said, it's time that the power was given back to the people, and that this should be
Absolutely.
a discussion between the people, and then the people then get to vote on the issue. And so it's really interesting that you say that. So, but now here's where the conflict comes in, I think, for a Christian. So you live in, like you said, a faith-based community more so than a lot of
That's
people,
correct.
say, down in Spokane in our districts. So let's say that let's say that you are in a district that isn't as faith-based, and the people are telling you, no, we want abortion. How do you resolve that between your personal convictions and what the Lord tells us and instructs us about life versus what the people are saying that they want?
This is exactly why I teach our founding values and our history. Because you have to understand, if you want to understand our form of a constitutional republic, that we believe in power of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so that if I don't have the power to tell my neighbor to put a mask on, inject something, to get an abortion, to not get one, to go to, then we cannot give that power to government. It's fundamentally impossible, because all power, especially on a constitutional level, if you read the Constitution, all power resides within the people. So then, therefore, we cannot give government power, and government cannot usurp the power to take something that we ourselves cannot tell each other what to do. And because we don't have people who know our Constitution, our founding values, and these basic principles, we think it's okay when a law enforcement officer oversteps their boundary. And this turns into one bad officer who then all of a sudden now we have to defund police. There's radical reactions because people don't understand founding traditional values of our country. The first publication our Congress printed in this country was the Bible, and they distributed it to schools.
Sure was.
So, and the reason for that was not necessarily to convert everyone to Christianity. It was to say, these are our founding values as far as our legal system, our morality system, how we hold each other accountable. And you have to understand that to participate in the system. And when we take that out of our government, as our founding fathers said, it doesn't work. So we as people of faith need to be bold and say, look, this is the truth. This is what our country was founded on. It's not working now because it's not, we've taken this out of it. So we must say, look, we're going back to the way it was because it worked then. It wasn't perfect. It will never be perfect. I mean, God doesn't allow perfect things. Otherwise, it's you're done. We strive for
But it
perfection.
is the longest
and that's our
serving
goal.
constitution. It is the longest serving
absolutely.
constitution of any other nation. I think the average. What's the average year of every other nation constitution? It's like 15 years, something like that.
Yeah, nowadays, especially as technology and humanity has progressed, the average span of a government has shrunk. Look at Israel and some of these others where parliaments are being flipped almost every other year, every 6 months. I mean, Italy's another one. The governments just don't. There's no cohesion. Now, because we were founding on those biblical principles, I wrote, one of my issues was about the Matrix of Liberty, and I don't know if you've heard about it, the National Monument of the Founding Fathers in Plymouth, Massachusetts. It's one of the largest statues in our country, and on it talks about the founding values, faith, morality, justice, education, all of those things that, but we don't talk about these things. And there has been a move to sanitize our education system, to sanitize our government system, to pull all religion out of all of that. And every step of the way, what has happened? Crime rates have gone up. Fatherhood has decreased. The welfare state has increased. Government makes bad
Abortion
parents.
has increased.
But abortion has increased. It's used as contraception now. So all of the things that in my lifetime, I'm 50 years old, but I remember in the 70s and 80s when these things were like, well, it's only for this case or only for that. And the talk was, well, yes, but it always leads to something. And as a young person, I'm like, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But in my lifetime, I can see, wow, they're absolutely right. From a faith-based perspective, the devil is the father of all lies, and it's one link at a time on the chain. It's the same thing throughout society. Well, we'll just allow abortions under this case or that case. Under what right do we or any human being say, well, that one is okay to keep and not? I don't want to personally take on that responsibility ever. And I don't think that we should give that right to somebody else because as a we the people type of thing, we don't have the right to determine life or death.
Right, but this is something that will be legislated, though. So how do you how do you reconcile your personal convictions, your personal belief, your personal faith, if your community were to tell you, no, Lonny, we want you to go and say that abortion is okay into the second trimester?
As much as I absolutely believe in 100% representing the people, my primary obligation when I take the oath of office is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and of Washington State. In those constitutions, it affirms our government derives its power from we the people. And that prevents me from passing any legislation that doesn't meet that constitutional test in my mind. If I don't have you have the power as a private citizen to tell you to do it, how am I supposed to derive that power? Because our Constitution does not allow me to do it. So I believe all things can be answered on a constitutional scale. We just haven't had very good leaders who know their Constitution, or at least the history.
But I would say that
because.
But I would say that.
Go ahead.
So then, when Justice passed down the ruling, and in his closing argument, he said it's time to pass this back to a vote of the people. So if it is unconstitutional, then his closing argument should have said that this is not constitutional. It's not constitutionally sound. Which then says, well, no one can legislate it because it's not constitutional. You can't legislate something that is unconstitutional by nature, right? So how would you argue that position when the justice of the Supreme Court who wrote the ruling said that, hey, it's time for this to go back to we the people and they get to debate this issue and then legislate it at the state level?
again, I always go back to the constitutional aspect of it. You have to see what power does the constitutional grant us to do. Now, I know that the people want this. Well, we have the power to change our constitution. So if you want something that bad, then the proper way to change the constitution to allow something that's not provided is to change a constitution. Now, if we change our state constitution, it must conform to the federal constitution. So provided that the people want to do that, we have an avenue to do whatever the people want to do. And that is our state constitution. That's the proper way to do things. So if the will of the people is there, then certainly the will of the people would be there to change the constitution. We've changed our constitution, especially in the state, several times.
But again, even if the state constitution allowed for abortion, your argument is that, well, federally, it's like at a federal level, under the actual Constitution of the United States, it is not abortion is not legal and cannot be legalized because because it doesn't grant us that power, right? Am I misunderstanding, or is that what you're saying?
No, I think you're right. I think we're going to start to see this phase of it now going to be litigated going back to the Supreme Court. One, we're going to say, okay, states have the right. Well, then you're going to have differing states. And we know on a federal level, when states really differ in things, the Supreme Court ultimately has to take up some aspect of that to provide uniformity. So yes, they've kicked it back to the states, and there was trigger laws that happened in some states. Some of them got sued to be stopped. And so in the states, in every individual state, ours included, is going to go through this. You're going to have a lot of consternation between the eastern part of the state or the more rural parts versus the populated states, because we are vastly different populations in culture and ideas. So this will become very heated, and the goal is for us to stay calm, to try and work with each other and say, look, you know what, I hear what you want, and you hopefully hear what we want, and let's work within the confines of a constitution, and how can we provide this? Maybe on a constitutional level, we decide that, look, under these circumstances, the burden may be under rape or incest, maybe the burden is too much for a person to force them to go through. That these are the tough choices that we should now talk about, now that it is in our court. And because for too long we've had many politicians say, well, it's not my choice anyway, it's on a federal level. And because of that, we haven't addressed these fundamental issues. We should talk amongst ourselves. And as a politician, then our goal is to find that middle ground. But under no circumstances, can we override our faith? At least I personally can't. God's my number one person. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. And ultimately, if there's something that goes against my conscience, I just can't do it. And I would have to prostrate myself in front of the people and say, look, I'm sorry, I can't do this. I heard you, and I hear that you want to do this, and I just can't do it. And if that means that you want me to resign or whatever, we'll talk about that, and you can choose another, representative. That's, to me, what a person of moral character should do.
Right.
That's integrity. Integrity means, look, my colleagues are saying this, everyone's saying this, you're saying this, but on a faith-based level, I can't cross that bridge. And if that means I can't represent you, I understand that and I accept that. That's also the humility part of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the reality is that if you stand for truth, you can never lose. Now, you might lose on an individual basis in the short term, but in the long term, God will prevail. And that's what this is all about. It's not about Lonny Ray Williams. It's not about Dale Whitaker. It's not about the organizations that we serve. It's about serving God first and foremost, and then following His instruction on the things that He wants you to do. When I was appointed executive director, I didn't know if this was for me, but I knew God was calling me to it. He had been telling me for about 2.5 years, I want you to do something for me. And I kept asking him, what do you want me to do? I mean, I'm not a pastor. I'm not a scholar. I'm an accountant. I mean, I'm sitting going, well, God, what do you want me to do? And then just doors continue to open and open and open. And then when Peggy, our prior executive director, resigned, she called me and she said, "Hey, the first day we met, God told me you'd be the future executive director of We Believe We Vote. So I'm resigning and I'm putting your name forward." And I was just like, "Whoa!" And it just made sense at that point. But for 2.5 years, like you said, some things take years to play out. And for me, it was this constant battle. And I kept talking to my wife and saying, "Honey, God's asking me to do something, and I don't know what it is." So we kept praying about it and praying about it and praying about it, and then things just started to like, it was just rapid how quickly it came to be. But I think that if you stand for truth and you follow those principles, that you cannot lose. You might lose a battle. You might lose a battle against the enemy, but your integrity, your morality, and the truth, the objective truth of God will stay intact, and you haven't foregone your values to please somebody. And we, as Christians, we should never forego our values to please somebody. And that's what I'm hearing from you, which I think is fundamentally fantastic.
You can't. Well, I can't, because look, he saved me from myself. I mean, I had my born again moment where I was out of the wilderness for 28 years, and I come back and prostrate myself, and all that sin gets lifted away. I've had miracles happen in my life. 10 years ago, I was a non-functioning human being. I was barely starting to get my cognitive abilities back after 4 years behind a stroke, and I could to pick out my clothes but couldn't tell you how to put them on. I couldn't answer the phone. I couldn't talk because my mind just couldn't find words. And all I did, what was follow him and just say, look, I'm just going to try and be a better person one day after another, and working on myself and continually trying to do something. And then several years later, geez, it was about 7-8 years ago, I have this born again moment, and boom, everything just works. My whole life changes. I meet a fantastic woman. My whole life goes in a different direction. And then 2 years ago, we okay, look, you need to start this printed thing. And I'm like, what? What do we do? It's a pamphlet. I mean, somebody, Thomas Paine did this back in 1776. This makes no sense. But yeah, here we are 22 issues later, and everyone's like, hey, you need to do this. And then, here's God again. Hey, you should go ahead and listen to these people. You should run. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Look at what I was. I mean, sure, I had a great successful life, but those fears of look at what can happen to a person, those are always there. But he's like, no, you need to do this. And then it's like, well, look, I'm a nobody. I'm a no-name. I don't do anything. It's like, it really doesn't matter if you win or lose. You're leading the people. It's my plan, not yours. Whoever you will go in contact with, whoever you will meet, give them your message. People need hope. They need to know that it's okay to be a little bit worried right now. We're going into the greatest food crisis of our lifetimes. And my main message to people, beyond that the parents are the primary stakeholders and money needs to follow the student, not failing schools, is our economy. Plant a garden. If you don't believe anything I ever say to you, please plant a garden right now, because every head of lettuce that you plant is one less you have to bring in on a truck. Every chicken egg that you gather is one less that's coming in on a truck. And if we do this as a people, collectively, we're increasing our resilience. And if all of a sudden the trucks stop going, we'll be able to figure it out. We can come together and make it happen, because collectively we've decided to try and support ourselves. And then we don't have to give away our powers by saying we're declaring an emergency because we're starving, and then we hand that over to the governor. No, real leadership means putting people together and getting them to work without even going to Olympia and passing a bill. We need people that say, look, we're going to go through some hard times, but we're going to be okay provided we get our act together and work as a community and not be so divisive. That's my main message throughout all we do. I want to give choice back to the people. Education choice, parental choice, whatever it is, it's all about liberty and freedom. And that's my primary message. Sorry if I'm going on too long.
No, I had a thought come to me there, because the thought that came to me while you were speaking is that you don't need power to lead.
That's correct.
You don't need to be given power by a state or a government in order to lead. And it sounds like you're leading at the you're leading from the dirt, literally. You're telling people to plant gardens, get chickens, and hey, let's raise each other up so that I can support you in a time of need. You can support me in a time of need. And we don't need that reliance on government. And we were never set up as a nation to have reliance on government. Limited government was there to serve a specific need, not to serve all of our needs. And now we're in a point where the government is serving all of our needs instead of serving specific needs. The role of the church has taken a back seat, whether by fault of church or government. I think it's a little bit of both, where government is imposing, the church is then backing off for whatever reason. And I think that is a time that the church steps up and says, no, this is a church function, not a government function, and we are going to help our people. Now, don't get me wrong. I know churches do this. My church does this all the time. My church helps with if someone's short on a utility bill, and they will help in that regard, and so on. So my church is very active in the community. I know of several others that are, and I'm not just speaking to my church, but I know they do this, and I know there are others in Spokane County that do this, and it's very, very important, actually. And I think that I would rather me personally write a check to someone who I know is struggling and is trying their best and is really, living a God and faith-based life to the best of their ability. I'd rather write them a check from my own pocket than say, go to SNAP, go to this, go to that, because it isn't Christ-like to say, go to someone else and ask for help. Christ helped those who needed help, and that he had criteria, but he helped people. And everything he did was purposeful. And that's what people don't understand. Every single thing he did was purposeful. And and I say people don't understand, Christians understand this, but I think that people who have an outward view or an outward look on who Jesus was and what Christianity is, they don't understand that everything, yes, Jesus was love. Yes, he was grace. Yes, he loved people. But it didn't mean that he tolerated everything we did. He loved people with truth, and that truth was harsh. That truth was very harsh in a lot of ways. And so the reality is that we need to step up and be more like Christ. We need to love people with truth. We need to be willing to help them. But we also need to be willing to then be wise enough to say, hey, you need to stand on your own 2 feet at some point, and we can help you get to that point, and that's showing Christ.
Absolutely. So, I think his main message was live like me. Now, we can get caught up in dogma, and that's where we fail. We have lots of churches that do this and this, but we don't come together because we get wrapped up in dogma. We're the true church. No, we're the true church. Look, there's only one true church, and that's Jesus Christ. Now, ultimately, we all may have differences, but really, he had one message: live like me. And if you try and be compassionate, if you selflessly, there's the key word right there. If you selflessly give, I did not understand gospel until I started doing service work. Then all of a sudden his message unlocked to me. That's why we tithe with our time, so to speak. I've been introduced to this phrase, and I didn't know it. I was doing it, but I didn't know that it was a concept. Don't just throw money at something. Throw your time at it. Well, I've been doing it. My wife and I do town halls, and we teach canning, self-resiliency, food storage, how to butcher pigs. I raise pigs for homesteaders and hand them out to people at cost. We don't make money on it. Our goal is to break even on feed, because my goal is to put as many people in the care of raising their own animals in this valley as possible. Why? Because during a hardship, guess what? There's a lot of people out there that have a few pigs. And there's a lot of people out there that have some chickens. And that means that as a community, we're better off. And here's something else I discovered about raising livestock. That helps you in your interactions between your fellow human being. If you don't take care of your responsibilities in your livestock, then you experience some really bad repercussions, and then they get sick and ill and possibly even die. And that happens anyway on a farm, and you're doing the best things. So that really brings life into perspective as far as my actions have a direct result and interaction on other life. And you just can't escape that. And when we understand that, we're less likely to get on Facebook and rant at somebody who just because we don't agree with them. And we're less likely to engage in a lot of the behavior that has caused so much rage in society. So there's benefits in building resiliency as well, and not being reliant on the government so much. And when we do this, it doesn't take much. When we do this, then we'll have more liberty, because we're more likely to say, nah, we don't need this. We don't need your food stamps. We don't need this, or whatever program it is that someone might not agree with. Once we build past that and develop this hand up, then we have a better community. Because when you hand out free stuff, and I know this as a disabled veteran, people get lazy and complacent. My life was really cush when I sat on the beach. I had a great beach house, 3.5 acres on the Pacific Ocean, but my life was miserable. I had no purpose. But that's how the VA wants people to retire. They send you massive amounts of medication, take this, and sit there, and that's what they wanted me to do. And I requested several times, look, I don't want to be retired. I want to do things. I know there's a program. It's like, no, we don't do that because people aren't successful in that. So it's a trapped society. So, by me taking this stand, I stand to lose a lot, but I don't necessarily care. It's more about the doing what's right. And when we are a moral people, and when we follow what our convictions are, regardless, as we know in Scripture, whether you're right or wrong, it's better than if you were one of those middle people who couldn't choose, the lukewarm people. So, and I believe that if we're living like him, loving like him, and just trying to be selfless like him, regardless of all the dogma and the other details, we're going to create a better society. And what better way to do that than to lead by example? That's what he did.
Yeah, and I think this lends to another issue too. So question 12 on the survey, the poor and needy, our statement is that providing a safety net for the poor and needy is the responsibility of individuals, families, churches, and local communities. It is not the responsibility of government, which primarily exists to protect citizens from foreign and domestic threats. Those who are able should be encouraged to work because the satisfaction of the fruit of their labor, regardless of how minimal or mundane, is dignifying and life-giving. The issue application is that many metropolitan areas have a growing problem with homelessness, which is often connected to drug addiction and mental health issues. Local government officials should focus on protecting the safety of all citizens by enforcing regulations against public disturbance, trespassing, and loitering. Our response is that government officials should leave the provision of housing, rehabilitation, and other social services to individuals, families, and private organizations that are better equipped to directly help the homeless. Additionally, local officials should support law enforcement with proper funding, good faith negotiations, and responsible accountability. You responded to strongly agree, a 10, strongly agree, and your comments were, government is incapable of meeting the needs of the poor and needy as it is inherently lacking the moral compass to make the right decision. Charity unlocks the true meaning of the gospel. Amen. Government programs rob good people of the knowledge and joy that charity can bring. You cannot mandate charity as it counts for nothing. And this is true. The Bible teaches, I would rather you not give. I would rather you give with a cheerful heart. I would rather you not give, unless you are willing to give with a cheerful heart. I just butchered that, but that is something that is near and dear to me because this is one thing that Christians all the time is, well, I don't really have enough to give, and then they feel guilt, and it's like, hey, you shouldn't feel guilt. Don't give unless you feel that you're going to do it without the expectation of anything in return. And before I was a Christian, I always, I was bad for this, and this was a learned trait from my mother. My mother was a lot like this also, that I did X, Y, Z for you. So then when I call and I ask you for a favor, you better be ready to help me. And this was something that on my journey as a Christian, I really had to self-reflect and go, you know what, that isn't right. Like if I'm going to help this person, if I'm going to pick them up from the airport, and in the future, if I ask them to do the same for me and they're just unable for whatever reason, I can't be upset at them about that. I did that because I wanted to. And so, but to this issue of the poor and needy, I totally agree with you that, and again, this is where I think the church lacks, whether it's lack of funding or lack of want, that they don't, as a whole, not every church again, they don't really push this and say like, hey, we are here to help you. But you need to work to be more like Christ also. So it's not just a one-way street, and that sounds conditional, but it's really not. It's like this is who we are. We are the wife of Christ. So in order to do that, we need to live to his standard, or at least try our best, and that's what we're instructed to do, is to live like Christ to the best of our ability. We all know we're going to fall short. And there's absolutely no way. He was perfection. He was good. He said, there was none good but me. Really. I mean, that's it. So we may think we're good people, but truly, what is good? Well, Christ is good. Well, can you live to that standard? Probably not. I know I can't. I try, but man, I fail every day.
We strive. That's all we can do. Yeah.
Right. And so to my question then, how do you think that you can rein this in at a state level, because we are more and more becoming a welfare state, not just in Washington state, but across the nation. In fact, I when Bernie Sanders was running and there's this whole socialist movement, I kind of adjusted that, hey, we're already the biggest socialist country in the world because we give more money in welfare than any other country. We just distribute it differently. So we might not have a socialist healthcare system, but we give a lot of money to hospitals to cover shortfallings from people who are uninsured and so on and so forth. So by definition, we are a huge welfare state in the United States, which was not the original intent. So how do you rein in that spending on these welfare programs that aren't helping the homeless, that they don't help the poor to re-find their feet?
I have a fantastic example of how the struggle that's going on right now in Colville, Washington. There's a small town hall group that I've attended and go to, and they have been politically active because there is a large 75-unit housing complex that they're trying to put in there. It's through the state system and a partnership through Catholic Community Services, and half of it is low income and half of it is homeless. Now, on the surface, that might sound great, but here's from my perspective. I was in a Catholic Community Services program as a homeless person when I had my stroke and I lost everything. Now, I accredit them helping me get back on track with that. However, in the best circumstances, and that was in Tacoma, in a city filled with many multi-faith organizations and everything else, they struggled to provide me the basic services that I needed to try and get back on track. And my daughter, who was a 17-year-old daughter, trying to graduate and get her life on track and piece my life together with all of the available city resources of Tacoma. And that's with all the state mixed in as well. So the reason that this is happening here is because Spokane does not want these organizations anymore because crime increases around them and everything else. Why is that happening? Because the resources aren't there to sustain a concentration of extremely needy people. So here's how they've been dealing with it in the area. Locally, they have large homeless populations that have been coming in from Spokane areas and camping in other areas. So they, as faith-based people, provide meals, they do what they can, they give blankets, they provide rides, they try and do those sort of things. So faith-based people need to step up. And then they can go to the community, which they have been going to their community meetings. And of course, the government down there, and many of them are all for it because, hey, jobs and money, never mind the social implications that's going to happen. Hey, it's just right now we can point to a multi-million-dollar project that we brought to the area. That's not the leadership we want, because behind that, you have to understand what type of impact this would have on a community. 75 fully needy families on a small community city like Colville would absolutely deplete the resources, because everyone in that family would need well checks and medical issues and all the other things, psychological help, addiction recovery centers. A lot of those are probably 30-day inpatient recovery centers. You know, there's so many different aspects. Right. But that's the government answer in a nutshell that doesn't even exist. So the faith-based approach doesn't even exist to support 75 new families coming in. And once you provide that level of institution, is it going to settle all the homelessness on the streets? for a very short period of time, but that place will be ultimately at capacity because there's 2-year waiting lists on Section 8 housing and all the other things. So they're going to be filled as soon as it's there, and it might not even be from the people that are on the street just a few hundred yards away. So the people themselves, and actually this is where churches need to step up. They need to get out of their dogma, work together and say, we're going to form a community coalition to take care of our homeless. Because if faith-based people, and it doesn't have to be exclusively faith, it can be just community-oriented. There's some pastors here. There's this casino over here is throwing in some money. Everyone's just donating their time, whatever anyone wants to do to make it happen. Then you have a community solution. And whenever somebody comes in and says, well, we're going to do this, no, our community handles it this way. And you support that,
right.
You build that, and you make it part of that community to where government says, hey, we're going to take care of the homeless. No, we got it. Thanks. We don't want you taking care of our homeless. Look what you did the last time. And so we as people have to step up, and especially as faith-based people, and that includes our institutions.
Well, and the other thing, too, I was talking to someone about this issue, and they said, well, hey, the government has a role because without the government funding, we wouldn't be able to build these buildings and so on. It's like, well, no, in fact, we would be able to if people weren't relying on the government to build the buildings. Because if we say, hey, our community is dealing with this way, in this way, we don't want your money. Hey, if you decide to contribute, that's fine, but you're not funding the project. You're not going to have control over the project. We control the project, and if you want to give money to this cause, feel free. But at the end of the day, you're not going to control it, because I think the big problem is government comes in, they want to do the and I think that's a lot of the times with good intent. We want to help the homeless, but the thing is, they also want control over how we help the homeless. And it's proven time and time again that it does not work when government get involved on these issues. There's a reason why Teen Challenge is so successful. There's a reason why UGM are so successful. Why are we not using dollars to prop up, taxpayer dollars to prop up these organizations? And I'll tell you why. I'll answer my own question. Because they're a Christian organization. That's why.
Yeah.
And it's disgusting. And it's abhorrent. Go ahead.
And we absolutely, as faiths, have the funds and the energy and the time to take care of this. You were waiting for that cause, but we have so much bureaucracy. I was looking at the voter guide that you guys have on there, the guide for parishes or for churches. What you can and can't do as a church or an institution. That hobbles us. And how many things like that do pastors and good men hold back because, well, it might threaten my tax exempt status. So in an essence, we have a government that puts us in this, well, to maintain your tax exempt status, you need to make sure that you promote this, do this, tell people to do this, fall in line, or you get penalized. Well, that means that we're kind of putting God secondhand to the tax man. My aspect on that, to all the big wealthy churches, look, you got a whole bunch. Why don't you just take a 50% tax hit, send it all to the government, get rid of your tax exempt status, and say we're going to do what God wants us to do? Is tax exempt status really worth that much?
I completely agree with you. I have this argument all the time. When Paul started the early church, he didn't say give up all and come to the church. They pay tax. When there's the story of the lady who they sold their land and they came to Paul and they said, here's the proceeds from the land. And he said, is this the proceeds from the land? And I'm paraphrasing. And she essentially said, yeah, that's it. And he's like, no, but is this all of the money? And it wasn't. She kept it because she was being greedy. And he said, I don't want any of it. And so basically what he's saying is, we want you to be all in or not at all. Right. And
absolutely,
kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he's saying. And I agree with you. It's when Paul came and they were giving to the church, the early church, Paul wasn't saying, let's not pay any tax. Hey guys, if you sell your land and you bring it to me, you won't have to pay tax on the sale of your land because you're then getting the tax break. No, they paid their taxes. Then they gave the rest to the church. So I totally agree with you, and this is an issue that we have at We Believe We Vote as an organization, is trying to penetrate the church and get these pastors on board with, hey guys, like God first. And we, as a culture and as a society, we are getting more and more away from putting God first because the church has stepped back, because the church is unwilling to go out there and talk to cultural and social issues that fly in the face of truth and in the face of God. And so they're leading with grace, which I completely understand, but being gracious isn't being accepting of people who live lives that are completely contrary to who Jesus was, who God is, and his moral, objective law. That is, period.
And the beautiful thing about that, when Christ asks us to pick up our cross and follow him, does he say, well, except for under this conviction or this or that? No, he says, look, I need you to pick up your cross and follow me. And this has been like a really humbling experience with me, especially doing what I'm doing, because ultimately this may cause the complete financial destruction of my family and everything else. We know politicians are very keen on destroying people whenever they can. It's already cost me in a lot of other ways. There's some viciousness in party leadership that is, boy, I wish it wasn't there, but that's just the reality of it. Ultimately,
we were warned against
it. That's right. Ultimately, I have to accept that by doing this, I am prepared to lose absolutely everything again, just as I have in my past, and start from scratch. This is what he asked me to do, and I am absolutely willing to serve the people. And when we put that in context, that's living the scriptures. And our pastors must be willing to do the same. Our churches must be willing to do the same. They must be able to say, we will stand on our moral convictions, whether we're flat broke and going outside and having our revival in the rain. It matters not to us. We don't need this cushy building. We don't need these cushy things. We only need Christ. And when we hopefully get back to that, we'll be a better people. And it's not an easy thing because we're all comfortable. I was comfortable. We've lived this entire life thinking we can do whatever we want, freedom and liberty secured. Well, over the past 2-3 years, we know that we're in trouble. And now we need to face those hard truths and say, well, where are we slaves? And we need to pray to Christ and say, how can we pull these chains off? How can we liberate ourselves so that we can be all that you want us to be? Because anything less than that, well, that's not exactly a place that I want to end up. And so when we move forward, and I think this applies to all churches, he will not ask us to do something where he doesn't provide a way. He will always provide a way. The people carrying the ark, the water didn't part until they stuck their foot down in it and all this. Okay, now the water's gone. They had to take that action and put the foot there. They didn't see the water move first. So when, this is how faith works. We act. And yes, it's scary because it's not conventional. It doesn't follow the logic of man. It's his logic. But when we put our faith in him, that he will have a way, he will unlock doors that we didn't even think of. This wasn't on my agenda or even thought process a couple years ago. It just is the natural progression of the path that he set me on. And that's just because I trusted him and started a crazy little pamphlet that talks about history that's gone to every all 50 states and like 56 countries around the world. I'm like, okay, well, that's cool. Didn't expect that. And it's all about history, values. Each one of these things talks about the way people interacted back then. Their honesty, their integrity, their loyalty, their hard work. As Christians, we recognize these as biblical principles. But we can teach biblical principles through history because they're there. And then it brings people to a little bit closer to God, and they say, okay, I know there's this divine creator up there. Don't know what it is. Good, hit your knees. He'll figure it out for you. I don't even need to tell you. And if you want to come to me, I'll give you some pointers, but I'd much prefer that you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ because he'll tell you where he wants you.
Amen. And I say this all the time. I have friends who are conservatives, but they're not Christians, and they live a
gospel life.
They live the same values, and they live and I have a question about why have you not given your life to Christ? You are a good person, as using the term good again, but as good a person as
Yeah.
any that I know. And so I just don't, why is it that? And so there's always an argument, but the reality is that the issue always comes down to submission. Because when you give your life to Christ, you have to submit, and we struggle with
Absolutely.
submission. We
Well, we're
struggle,
selfish people
everyone, man,
naturally.
women. Yes, we are.
Yeah, we're absolutely
And so
selfish.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
And yeah, through that process, you have to give up yourself. You have to be willing, and this is my struggle now. I mean, when I was first retired, I had all the time in the universe to play video games, do whatever I wanted, and the life of a disabled veteran to have those basic things taken care of and just take my meds and be happy. But I had no self-worth. And so he created a process that I had to follow him, and I got off on a different tangent and I lost the original topic. But essentially, I had to follow him. And it wasn't like he said, "Hey, Lonny, this is the way life's going to be for the next 12 years. You're going to turn left, go right, hit the interstate." It doesn't happen that way. It's like, what do I do today? I can't figure out, what I'm supposed to do today. And my mom's mad at me, whatever our individual circumstances is. I got in a car accident, had a bad day at work with the boss. Whatever it is that causes, I just don't know anymore. There's one person we can all turn to. And as we start doing that, and like you said, those people living gospel principles but not a gospel life, ultimately, I think, and this is my personal belief, my grandfather was the greatest man in history to me, a good, kind, loving man, but he left the church. Well, in the church's eyes, well, that's it for him. I personally don't believe that. I mean, that's a rudimentary level, and it's not exactly that cut and dried, so I don't want to label it like that. But there are many in the church who feel that, well, if you don't do this, you don't do this, you don't do this, then you're just not going to make it. I look at Christ, and if you're a morally good person, and you're good with him, that's all that matters in my book. And I'm not in the position to judge that. Only him. So,
right. And you're saved by grace through faith alone. So that is the ultimate. That is your ultimate salvation. Now we do have obviously instruction of things that we should be doing in our lives, that repentance and so on and so forth. But all these things point to us being more Christ-like. So they're in community and so on. So these things are important, I think, for us to follow these instructions. But it isn't the end of your faith if you were to leave the church. I would never recommend that as for someone to do, but it isn't the end of your faith. It isn't your end of your relationship with Christ. And I think that's important because now, especially nowadays, maybe not back then, but nowadays, there are people who struggle to get to church, not because they have busy lives perhaps, but because they are disabled or, they don't have a ride or, and so on, or their typical ride isn't there. So now you can get online and you're viewing it live and and there are times where I'm working right now. I'm working around the clock. I was up till 3 a.m. last night. I'll probably be up till 3 a.m. again today. Trying to work on We Believe We Vote things. So on the Sundays where I haven't been able to get to church, I watch online. And so am I then not attending or am I attending? Or am I, if you're not there physically, does that mean that you're not part of the church? I don't know. I don't think so. I think as long as you're in communion with your fellow Christians and so on, then you are living up to the standard of church.
I think I can help you out with that because I'm actually writing a story right now for my pamphlet that comes out in a couple of days, and this one's a little bit more centered on family. And back then, you might be shocked to find out that in many areas of the country, people didn't go to church. They did their services at home. It was the father who was the head of their church at home. And the average family size back then was 9 children. Or 9 to 12 in some families. I mean, the more children you had, that was your resilience. And it was expected that 1 or 2 of them would die. And many people weren't legally married at all. And I forget which state it was or which colony, but I want to say Virginia, but it might be somewhere in the South. The price of a marriage license was $50 back then. Now, that was a 6-month salary of a minister or a year's salary for a teacher. So most people did not even bother. Instead, they ran an advertisement for 2 weeks in the, well, I guess we'd consider it a newspaper nowadays, but they ran these local advertisements announcing that they were married because that's all that they could do. You know, a lot of the things that we do now, or we consider what is church, well, they had a different view on it back then. That's why I think we need to learn our history, because the true religion was your faith to the Savior, Jesus Christ. And as long as you held to that, read your scriptures, did what you could in your own capacity, I believe in a loving God, and he's acknowledging that you're doing what you can, that's good enough. And I believe in that in a loving and merciful God, that I'm honestly trying. Well, you're trying. We're all trying. And look, if I can't get to it on Sunday, well, maybe I take Tuesday, shut everything down, and really worship him in my own way. Does it really matter? You know, some people have to work on Sundays. And now this is a dogma point, and some people can get ostracized. But I think the point is that ultimately, on a personal level, what matters is our personal relationship to our Heavenly Father, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. You know, how do we interact? Are we striving? Are we trying? I think that he accepts, he knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows when I'm putting 150% into following him. He knows when I'm like, I don't really feel it today. I can't lie to him. So ultimately, he's going to know if I've done all that I can. And I think that's good enough, and I think that's what most Christians need to understand. If you're doing all that you can, it is good enough. Just keep trying. And when we think of it like that, it answers a lot of questions.
Yeah, and I mean, church truly is where two or more are gathered. I mean, when you are in communion with fellow believers and so on, and so and marriage truly is a covenant between you, your wife, and God. You don't need a legal piece of paper in order to be, married. I personally believe that. So when we were married by a pastor, and the pastor gave us a marriage certificate. So to me, we might not be legally married as per the state of Washington, but once that pastor handed me that piece of paper, we were legally married, in my opinion. Legally
and
between me,
eyes.
my wife, and God. Yes, the covenant is
and that's
between
all that
me,
matters.
my wife, and God. Yes.
I believe
now that's
that.
not to say though. That's not to say though that because this is where it gets kind of dicey, because people say, well, are you truly married though, because you're not legally married, and therefore you're committing adultery. So it's kind of dicey, and I understand the different perspectives on this. But I think the true essence of marriage, and this is why I always get confused as to why people who don't believe in God and don't believe, or maybe are in the LGBTQ community, why do you want to hijack marriage? Because marriage is between a man, a wife, and God. That by nature, that is the definition of marriage. Is it's a covenant between a man, a wife, and God. It's biblically that way. And so for me, I just never understand why someone wants to hijack the institution of marriage for that purpose, because God plays a role in marriage.
I think I can help you out through this, and if you, probably from a scriptural point of view. If you look in the scriptures, the idol worshipers took God and put it into an idol form. It's the same way here. They're taking marriage and putting it into an idol form. Now, as our souls, probably on the fundamental level, crave to be godly, crave to achieve all that he wants us to do. And now this is me theorizing, of course. And so, of course, we all want to have that sanctity of marriage, although I'm going to get rid of the God part of it. I just want the marriage part. Well, do you really need to be married? Because the only and that they can, certainly they should have the right to do whatever they want within their own confines. But here's how I reconcile that. I don't believe there should be any state or government marriage licenses. I just don't. If you want a faith-based thing, that's great, and that makes you whole and harmonious, great. That makes me happy on a spiritual level. My pastor, preacher, whoever gives the marriage, we're good. Back then, if you couldn't find one, you ran an ad for 2 weeks. Our founding fathers found a way, but they made that commitment by saying we're together. Everybody knows, we're together, and that was their vows. And whatever it means, I don't think that government is ever good at getting in family decisions, and marriage is one of those things. This and why they, well, you get a tax break, you get this. There's benefits of being married. Look, we're together, we do things together. What's the problem here? When you take government out of making those moral decisions on what constitutes marriage, then you get rid of a lot of these problems. We wouldn't have this argument if government.
We also do have there is a direct correlation between no-fault divorce and single parenthood, though. So it is an interesting topic because those things are directly correlated. And so you can see the trend from the time of no-fault divorce on that you see single parenthood increasing and so on. And so it's interesting that there is a direct correlation to this perception of the government legal standing of marriage.
I think one of the challenges is what's happened to our family unit over many, many decades. Whereas before it was plausible where you have one parent being the breadwinner, one being the rearer, and you had family values. And where I think this challenge is, you have the greatest generation, which was the World War II generation. My grandfather's that generation. Wonderful people, loving people, family people, Christian people, good values. And then all of a sudden, you have the most selfish generation in humankind behind that. Now, why did that happen? Because these people lived through the Great Depression, World War I, World War II, all of these things, and they said, my children will suffer for nothing. I will provide them everything. And they won't want for anything. And my parents were the same way. My parents, I love them dearly, but they were terrible parents. They didn't teach me anything. They let me do what I wanted to do, and didn't teach me any moral values or upbringing and that. Like I said, I love them dearly, but their mind was wrapped up in worldly things. And now that began, right, I think, at that schism right there. And then what happens? We know that psychologically, generations, these problems typically follow down the line. So, I didn't necessarily know how to raise my kids. My first marriage and my first chance at parenting, I was not a very good father. I was a selfish individual. I wasn't in the Lord right then. I wasn't a good parent. It took me a while to learn these things, like years to learn these. Whereas before, if you have that family or that family unit to teach those values, then you have a stronger chance of carrying those on. So what's the solution? The solution can be faith-based. If you look back in the colonial eras, most marriages lasted 12 years. Shocking. But the reason is that death and mortality caused that. So you had a huge portion of blended families. They didn't stay separated. Yep. They quickly found another spouse to blend their families because the family unit was that important. If you did not have the family unit, that's correct. You would die. You needed the children to help out, to help produce, to do things, and the whole family unit. If it wasn't strong, you were impoverished. And the poorhouses back then were prisons. So government wasn't the solution back then. You didn't want to go to the poorhouse. So you did everything you could to avoid that situation by doing it through the family. So right. I wouldn't, what we're not doing is getting remarried. We're saying, well, that was a terrible experience. I'm not going to do it again. Instead of saying, right, well, that was a terrible experience, but my children need a father, or my children need a mother. And I now have an obligation, now given the pool of people, of quality people is not there, but we should have an obligation to say, well, my children need this, therefore I need to put it as a priority, even though maybe I'm not ready. And back then it wasn't about people being ready or what their feelings was, it was raw survival, and we need to think that way. Right.
Well, I would say that part of the reason too, so there's no-fault divorce is part of the reason why we see this single parenthood going on. But it's also, like you said, when you get into being a single parent, the government puts so much, they say, oh, hey, we'll take care of you. No worries. You don't need a dad. And so so back to the issue of the poor and needy, actually, my wife went through this when she was divorced from her first husband. He was very abusive. He was an alcoholic. And when she, actually, he divorced her. He told her, I want a divorce. And the church told her, like, hey, you've had ample reason for divorce, adultery, abuse, and so on. she said okay, and reluctantly, she didn't want to, but she reluctantly got divorced, and obviously in hindsight, it was the best thing she could have done. But when she went to the state and she said, "Hey, I need help. I am a single parent, yada yada yada," she got on a HUD, and she had a HUD house for about 6 months, and she started her own cleaning business. And when she went to turn in the keys for the HUD house, because her Christian convictions told her, I don't need this now. I'm now in a position where I can get my way out of this, and I'm stable and so on and so forth, and I can provide for my family. The lady at HUD said to her, hey, are you sure? Because once you do this, it's really hard to get back on. And it wasn't just one time she said this. Multiple times she tried to encourage her to not hand in the keys to the HUD house. Multiple times. Serena said, no, I'm good. I'm good. I'm stable. I have a good job now. It pays well, and I know God's got me. And she said the lady looked at her like bewildered. They want you to be dependent. They want you to be dependent on the state because that gives them the control that they want. And so I think it's really important that people understand that maintaining that family unit is stability. And it's not just stability for the individual, it's stability for the entire family, financially, emotionally, and so on. And the problem is no-fault divorce has led to the degradation of the family unit because it gives people, there's no incentive now to work through issues. There's no incentive at all. They don't have the godly incentive. They don't have a biblical incentive. They don't have a personal incentive. It's just, this was fun. We had a child together and we'll deal with that, but I'm out because I can't deal with this anymore, whatever this may be. And oftentimes these issues are so trivial, but people are so immature and don't have an ability to have some self-reflection and understand that maybe you're part of the problem, and maybe there are things that you need to work on, and your spouse too. But there are things that you need to do. Instead, they blame each other. They don't want to work on their marriage, and they let the family unit fall apart, regardless of what happens to the children, regardless of where those children are emotionally, and it destroys the family unit financially and emotionally on all sides. Guys may say, oh, I left her, she was crazy or whatever. And women may say the same thing. Oh, I left him, he was abusive and whatever. But the reality is that even in circumstances that aren't the best, and I'm not saying abuse or anything like that. I'm saying, the real trivial issues where it's like, hey, guys, you could have worked this out. Like, why are you guys divorcing over this? And the reality is they just don't want to work at it. And that's a problem with the family unit. And so how do you go into the legislature and how do you fix no-fault divorce in the legislature? How do you be so pro-family that you say, hey guys, we need to look at this family issue and we need to fix no-fault divorce because it's just not good for us as a society?
My number one priority in running is running as parents are a primary stakeholder. Now, what that means in fancy language to the government is you have the right to raise your children how you see fit, and how that fits. Boy, that's my number one role right there. Is first to recognize parental rights, because if we can't recognize parental rights, we can't even begin to have the legislature tackle no-fault divorce. If they can't recognize that parents are the primary stakeholder in their child's upbringing, they certainly can't recognize that no-fault divorce is a problem. Because in the state size, many legislatures or many individuals that aren't even elected but yet are running government, in their eyes, and I know I was a federal employee in government, and I had the same perspective. Well, I'm here to help people. I'm doing good. I'm actually saving people. I'm preserving freedom. All these things that I thought I was doing good, but I wasn't. Government is not the solution. Had I had that same mentality in a faith-based organization, I would have done much better than trying to fix things in government. So essentially, we need to fix the legislature, and that starts by voting in legislators that are going to listen to the people and represent the people. Because if the people come to me and say, I want this bill, I have an obligation to put it up. And if they don't take it up, I can tell them they didn't take it up, but here's the guy you need to call. Your mom over in that county over there, have her call her legislator. And so we need to identify where government breaks down and then say, okay, I can't get it done because of this, but I need your help. If you want this done, let's come up with a game plan. Let's figure out how to move it forward. That's called leadership. That's integrity. To be able to stand up and look at the reality and say, well, it's not happening here, but I'm willing to make it happen on your behalf. A good example of this is like voting for empty seats in schools. During COVID, all of a sudden, everyone started doing homeschooling. They started seeing what was actually being taught to their children, and people of faith pulled their children out en masse. We decided to go homeschooling as well. We test scores have gone up and everything's phenomenal. Everything's good now, but it was a scary proposition to all of a sudden say, okay, well, now we're teachers on top of everything else. But
and you can probably teach your kids. You can probably teach your kids twice as much in half the time, right? There's no distractions. When it's school, it's school.
My 17-year-old daughter was getting A's and B's, right, when she was in the public system, all these wonderful things. And here we are in the home. We're saying, okay, we're going to cook. Here, measure, it's half a cup. Just turn it into a third. And she's like, starts drawing all these circles and everything else. And like an hour later, she's like, I don't know. We're like, no, all you got to do is this. And she's like, no, we can't do that. What?
It's not exactly one third.
Right. Yeah, and so, but the point was they weren't teaching her. And then we did an assessment, and she was years behind. So we went from ground one. We found a company, I think backpack.com or something, where you can get books from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, school books with teachers' editions to complement them. You can teach your kids from any era, and great for home ec, if you want to teach your kids how to really cook. And basically, that's what we did is take on the role as teachers, and we figured it out. Well, now she's gone from someone who's totally disinterested to participating to society. She's now the president of a Turning Point USA chapter, is being totally involved in her life, and she's like, I wish I would have been involved in politics earlier. She's only 17. So, but she understands that she must take her whole life and apply it to trying to win her and secure her freedom, because government is failing her. But yet, how many kids of that age actually understand that? The public school system would not have conveyed that information. So that's,
and they have they have an agenda to not do that. So, Lonny, it's been fantastic having you. What would be your message to your constituents and to the voters in your district?
My message is, regardless of who you're voting for, make sure that you do your homework. Look at all the bills and look at the bills and see, did that person vote on that bill? Do you support those votes? Is that conducive? What does it do? If it really supports what you think is your values, then you know what, go ahead and vote. But if you find the same troubles that I did and you're looking for representation, then I'm your guy. If you're looking for someone that you can pick up the phone and call, and I'll answer my cell phone and say, yeah, what's going on at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning? Ask people around here. You know that I'm that type of person. And that's the type of legislator that you need. You need someone that's going to represent you. It doesn't take a bill. Excuse me. It takes someone who's willing to hold your hand. If you're going in front of a school board and they're not talking with you, you give me a call. Even though I'm not your legislator right now, I'll show up. I'll hold your hand, I'll be there with you, and I'll make sure that you get treated fairly. That's leadership. It doesn't require somebody to be in office. And I'm that type of person, and if that's what you want, then I'd suggest that give me your vote, please.
And where can people reach out to you and to get in contact with you?
The easiest way is on my website. That's LonnyRayWilliams.com. That's LonnyRayWilliams.com. And there you can support me, reach out, contact me. The 800 number that's listed rings right to my cell phone. You can get me anytime. It's toll-free throughout the entire district. I'm making myself available, or contact at LonnyRayWilliams.com. We'll get your message and we'll get you there, and you can support me at that website as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lonny. It was a pleasure to meet you. Guys, LonnyRayWilliams.com. LonnyRayWilliams.com. Thanks, Lonny.
Thank you.